My name is Kelaidis, and I'm the resident scholar at the National Hellenic Museum. And you're about to watch my interview with Fr Tony Vrame on the history of Greek Orthodox fasting practices and the role that fasting plays in the formation of Greek identity today. Father Tony is the director of the Department of Religious Education of the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of America. He's also adjunct professor at Holy Cross Greek Orthodox School of Theology. He's a well-known author and speaker on topics related to theology and religious education. He's a Chicago native with a bachelor's degree from DePaul and a master's degree from the University of Chicago. He then left the great city by Lake Michigan to earn a Master's of Divinity from Holy Cross School of Theology and a PhD from Boston College. I hope you enjoy our interview. Kali Anastasi and Kalopaska. And hello, Father. Thank you so much again for joining us. And I suppose full disclosure to the audience, our relationship with one another goes back to the beginning of my adult life. I met you when I was 18 years old, believe it or not.
The OCF, at the OCF in Berkeley.
At the OCF in Berkeley. So we've known each other for a minute, as it were. And I really appreciate you agreeing to do this. I think it's really important when we're talking about the church and its traditions and the way it creates Greek and Greek American traditions to really dig into the history, because I think that's interesting. And I am one of the people who picks guests for this series. So
Well, there you have it.
Exactly. But we really appreciate you taking this time for us. So I'll just start, sort of start at the very beginning, very good place to start. Can you just sort of tell us about sort of the earliest records of Christian fasting practices and where the sort of, where fasting comes from sort of at its origin?
Yeah, well, again, thanks for having me, letting me do this. It's a kind of a great experience for me as well. But and good to connect with you too. And but yeah, fasting, it obviously it predates Christianity.
Yeah.
I mean, one, generally speaking, almost every religious faith tradition that I know of, Christian, and non-Christian, has some discipline of fasting in its practice. One. Secondly, I mean, right now we're in the first day, second day of Ramadan. So
absolutely.
So our Muslim brothers and sisters are fasting, all day long right now. Right, and waiting for the evening fast. So it's just kind of baked into religious practice. Now, for us as Christians, we first begin to identify or see fasting, of course, in the Old Testament, literally in the book of Genesis. It's there from the beginning. God tells Adam and Eve, you can eat everything you want in the garden except this one item.
There you go. I never thought of it that way.
Yeah, so there's a fast imposed on Adam and Eve in the Genesis story from the very, very beginning. I'm going to reference every now and then the document from the Holy and Great Council from 2016 that you'll be able to read on your own. But even Basil the Great, I'll get you the link. Basil the Great.
Sorry, in Cairo, we'll put that in the bio for everyone.
And Basil the Great says, according to the document, fasting is as old as humanity itself. So it's there. So we see it throughout the Old Testament, that in specific moments of, the people of Israel's life, they're being commanded to fast as well. It's not just Adam and Eve who, because they break the fast by eating of the tree, are cast out of paradise, right? That's what got them out.
Yeah, I never thought of it that way. You just blew my mind. Like
the hymns of Lent say it's because of this that we go into we're doing this, and that's why we're in Lent. So, but at other times throughout the history of the people of Israel, they are being commanded to fast before a great deed. Moses has to do this. They're just all these examples of the Hebrew people fasting from fasting. And it doesn't even describe what that means. We have to take it as this in this way. Fasting means not eating anything, right?
Yeah.
At all. I mean, those of us that, go to the doctor for a blood test and you're told to fast before you eat nothing. That's what the term really means. What most Orthodox Christians do is abstain from certain things, right? So linguistically, we're going to talk about fasting, but we're really meaning abstaining from certain foods. So, but when the Old Testament, and even then when you get into the New Testament, when it describes whether the Hebrew people or the early Christians fasting, they're eating nothing for a period of time, days, hours, whatever it is, depending on the situation, but it's usually days before some great event. The other example, and again, in the interest of time, we know that in the New Testament, fasting exists. Jesus himself fasted for 40 days before he began his public ministry. Right? So it's that. So, I mean, it's just that as simple as that. I mean, in the Gospels. And, but then again, throughout the early church history and the Acts of the Apostles, whenever there's a great moment of decision-making in particular, the first Christians are fasting before they make the decision. They pray and they fast before they appoint so-and-so to do something. Those kinds of things. So we just know it's just kind of baked in to Christian life, as St. Basil says, and it's as old as humanity itself.
Well, that's an excellent introduction, and you just blew my mind with the Adam and Eve were fasting in the Garden of Eden thing, because I just had never thought of it that way. So
yeah.
Yes. Well, there you go. That's all we need for today. You can go now. Don't really go. Cairo will kill me. Now when so it becomes part of the Christian tradition out of Judaism, as you say. And then can you kind of describe to us how in the Byzantine period, the Lenten fast and Lenten liturgical traditions developed? Because I think something that's very interesting, it might be interesting to our non-Greek audience, of which there are legions, Father. Sure. Legions. That fasting and Lenten practice in the Eastern Church looks quite different than the Lenten practice that our Catholic neighbors, for example, observe. Right. And so I would be really interested if you kind of talked maybe about that in the context of the Byzantine period, and maybe highlighted some of those differences you might think are interesting to people kind of living on the streets, as it were.
Well, a couple of things on that. Obviously, as Christianity becomes part of the Roman imperial, then later we would call it Byzantine life, and even under the Ottoman Turkocratia life, the fasting practices are evolving in concert with the way our liturgical life is developing as well. As according to my, preparation for this, I mean, by around the 11th century, we've already established our basic liturgical calendar of feast days, right? The feast days just didn't all get, what we think of as the great feasts of the church, all didn't just emerge in the same time period. It took time. So we know the oldest of the feasts is Easter, Pascha, right? For obvious reasons. And then from that, other kinds of things begin to develop over time. And with that, preparing oneself to observe the feast begins to take place, and fasting becomes part of that discipline. So since Easter, the resurrection of Christ is the oldest of the feast days, the first of the feast days, the greatest of them, as we say,
Yeah.
the practice begins around there. And we even see that expanding over centuries into what we have today. So the first Christians, just for a few days before celebrating the resurrection, observed a fast. And then it's a fast of eating nothing for a few days, right?
Okay. Oh, wow. Okay, yeah.
Literally, just basically from Thursday, what we would think of as Holy Thursday, to the resurrection itself, Sunday, right? But over time, that gets lengthened into the 40 days and into the pre-Lenten period, as people were being prepared to be baptized, as the discussions which is most scholars see as one of the origins of Lent. It's the last preparation of those who needed to be baptized. So fasting, now it becomes, from fasting goes to abstaining. Nobody's going to stop eating for 40 days or even longer, as we have today. So the abstaining begins to fill into this. And there are the discussions within the church itself of when are you supposed to observe the fast. The classic examples are, do you fast or observe these fasts on the weekends? Sunday in the Orthodox Church is never considered a fast day. Fasting, but today our fasting rules, we say they're relaxed. If you look at the calendars, fish and wine and oil are allowed. So we are relaxing the fast. Holy Saturday, the question about, is not meant to be a fast day, except, that's Holy Saturday. Saturday is not supposed to be a fast day either, except Holy Saturday.
Oh, okay.
So all these discussions about, well, then how do you get to your 40 days? All of this kind of stuff. So how do you begin to figure this out? So we see this in the Lenten fast in particular, and we're doing this at the end of Lent right now.
So just real fast, this will show up during Holy Week. This will be
here we are.
Wednesday.
And again, okay. Holy Week, of course, is not part of Lent.
No.
Let's start there. I mean, I remember as a kid going from Easter, counting back to figuring out 40 days. Wait a minute, there's another week. Holy Week is a special fast period. They don't tell you that in Sunday school. But nevertheless, so we're talking about this Lenten fast, this Holy Week fast today. But we see this gradual development of this. And then with some of the other feast days, taking their time as they become established in the liturgical calendar to associate fasting with the preparation for those feasts. So again, but by the 11th century, it's all pretty well locked into place.
Yeah.
I was talking to a friend of mine about this, and he said, well, the Byzantines, there was a certain kind of looseness around it in the society. And what begins to happen is the influence of monastic practices onto the life of the faithful. They see the monks fasting in a particular way and for particular periods, for particular lengths of time. And so people say, well, if they're doing it, I should do it too. And so today we say the fast isn't just for monks and clergy, it's for everyone.
And I think that's actually a really interesting point. And I don't want to get too off of our track here, but this idea of this sort of dialogue, I guess, between the monastic practices and the practices within parishes, right? Is a really interesting conversation, I think, that has some, not to get too in the weeds, but has some contemporary resonance, right?
Yeah. Oh, for sure. And again, in the Byzantine tradition in our life, it's a dialogue. It's the two looking at each other, as sources, essentially, as to how to do this. And the church, of course, when it gets official, is trying to navigate what makes sense for people in the world, as we say, as well as for what makes monks, what works for monks and nuns. And again, every monastic community then can establish its own typikon, as we would say it, not of its and rhythm of its life, and that would include even how it fasts and when it fasts and observe it. It's not, yeah, they tend to be fairly universal, but if a monastery wants to say this is how we do it, that's how they do it, right? And it's in conformity with what everybody else is doing, but it can be different.
And that's really interesting.
And so then the church then is trying to say, okay, now this is how people in the world, again, as we say, this is how we try to observe it. Because the church leadership, even scholars would say, listen, and again, you think of where this is coming from, our origins in a rural societies that probably most of our ancestors lived in, working hard on the farms, working hard physical labor. And one liturgical scholar I read in preparation for this said, you can't expect people who are working that hard to observe the same level of fast as others who can stop and slow down and, those kinds of things. So we know that. So that there's discretion given in the practice, both to the church itself to figure out how to do this and guide people, but also then for the individual to work with their parish priest or a spiritual father or spiritual mother to figure what works for this person, taking into account their physical abilities, their age, their and how they're going to apply this, how they're going to bring this discipline into their lives.
And just to check, we're allowed to have lobster, right?
Yeah, shellfish. Yeah. But it was interesting. One of the things, when one of the documents I was reading in preparation, things like shrimp, shellfish, I don't know about lobster. I don't know about, the price of lobster in, Greece any days, but it was seen as cheap food. Now we think of lobster typically now as luxury.
Yeah.
But it's seen as cheap. So yeah. And it goes to this idea, as I understand it, of avoiding foods, protein sources in particular, animal sources that have blood in them. Shrimp and lobster and crab don't have blood in them.
Excellent. Yeah, no, I guess that's the dividing. I remember sort of vaguely being told that at one point that it's the. I think there might have been some folk theologizing I got around that about it's the blood and the blood of That's really interesting. So the Byzantine, so history ended at the Byzantine period. They're still an empire. Everything's fine, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, basically, everything was wonderful. Yeah. Until 1453.
Okay. Did something happen in 1453 we should know about?
Yes.
I hate to, you're going to need to break this to our audience. So in 1453, Constantinople falls to the Ottoman Empire. Yeah. And large swaths of the Orthodox world, not just sort of Greek-speaking people, but large swaths of the Orthodox world come under the authority of the Ottoman Empire. And something I've become interested in recently is the ways the Turkocratia influenced Orthodox practice, right? And the ways that experience changed how we practice Orthodoxy. And I was wondering if you could comment on that in sort of through the lens of Lenten and Paschal practices.
Yeah, well, there's still probably a lot we don't know. Obviously, the liturgical rhythm continues. That's not interrupted by the Ottoman period. What I did come across on the topic of fasting, though, is we see more and more discussion of, and not discussion, but the more and more ideas about how one prepares to receive Holy Communion, and this idea of fasting for 2, 3, 4, 7 days prior to receiving communion. Again, abstaining from certain things, but the fast, the pre-communion fast, seems to become much more important in this period from what I've read, one. And it probably, again, the scholarship seems to indicate it, for whatever reason, it's largely because infrequent communion became more popular. I hate to put it that way, but that's, more common. So now the church is trying to help people prepare for something, a moment that they're only doing every now and then. It's unclear.
Do we know why that is?
No, it's unclear. I was trying to figure that out, but it just, but it just seems to be going on in the society. I mean, as far as I know, it's not like, people could stop attending services. They just, participating in the Eucharist became less frequent. So then you see, in order to prepare now, you've got to fast this. You have to fast this way. So
is this when we start? Sorry, I didn't mean to. Go ahead, continue. I'm sorry.
So that's when we begin to see this practice, even to this day. I'll bet many of the people watching this were probably told, and if you have to fast a week before receiving Holy Communion, which is, a generation ago, that was commonly taught still.
Yeah.
Right? And so, but it does seem to have its roots in the Turkocratia because of the infrequent communion.
So you referenced this, sort of a previous generation, there was this, the practice of infrequent communion kind of was still part, I think, of how we thought about communion, certainly, in Greek communities. I mean, I remember, very pious people I knew growing up of my grandparents' generation and things who only received communion on, Easter, Christmas, and their name day, for example.
Right.
Because there was this.
Don't forget Panagias.
And Panagia, yeah. And so who had very because they had very strict fasting practices around that. I mean, even my own grandfather, when he was dying, we had to have Metropolitan Isaiah call him and tell him it was okay to receive communion from the, because he couldn't, he was not supposed to be fasting, certainly, and avoiding protein with cancer. And he was, we had to phone a friend, basically, with hierarchical credentials to convince him of that. And so I was wondering, you're in a role in church education, and I was wondering what sort of, at the institutional church, what kind of challenges that presents to them as they're confronting, I think, a society that's become less religious, and challenges in terms of, I think, and maybe I'm projecting here, the sacramental life of the church is one of the things that keeps younger people, millennials and others, connected to the church. But if there is this sort of received wisdom or folk practice around very strict, very strict adherence to fasting protocols before communion, what kind of messaging is the institutional church sort of engaged in?
Oh, it's very simply because you've put together a lot there.
Yeah.
To untangle it a bit. Most people, again, a good generation ago, people like my parents, your parents, grandparents, had been taught, yes, you receive communion 3-4 times a year. And then there was this intense preparation for it, of usually about a week of abstaining, especially from meat. And of course, the pre-communion fast that day, truly a fast, still in place, still being taught, as part of this. And that's, the pre-communion fast is also as old as the church. So in the 1960s and 70s, as this was being looked at in the church, the Orthodox Church, especially here in the United States, undergoes what we would consider a liturgical renewal. And people like the late Father Alexander Schmemann, the late Father Maximus Agiorgusis, who becomes the Metropolitan of Pittsburgh, begin, and others, Father Stanley Heracus, start traveling around the country, start talking about this, our liturgical participation, and they make one simple assertion. The main reason for attending liturgy is to participate in the Eucharist. And, right, one. Secondly, and again, knowing from the scholarship that this kind of decoupling how we fast from that preparation, that the assumption of fasting as a discipline is not just preparing for Holy Communion, but is part of our discipline as Christian lives. So observing Lent, the Holy Week fast, the Panagias fast, et cetera, Wednesdays, Fridays, et cetera. And if you're just doing all of that, then you just observe the pre-communion fast on a Sunday morning or on the day of the service, et cetera, and receive the Eucharist. But the assumption is the Eucharist is being celebrated on the assumption that basically everybody there is going to receive.
Yeah.
So that shift, you know, like I said, by the late 1960s, by the mid 1970s was, I would say, was a tectonic plate hitting us as Orthodox, especially here in the United States, about this. So things really, really changed. So in my role as a religious educator, naturally, I'm going to present this idea that the reason for coming to the Eucharist, or they're coming to the liturgy, is to participate in the Eucharist. And how do we prepare for that and teach this tradition of observing these fasts seasonally and on whatever the day of the week is kind of thing, Wednesdays and Fridays, on a consistent basis. So that when you come, and then teaching our tradition, but in a very new way for people, and overcoming a lot of but Father, I was told this and I was told that kind of stuff. That happens all the time. So.
Well, you probably don't remember this, but one of the sort of foundational ways I understand the difference between Orthodoxy and Western Christianity, you played a hand in creating with an offhanded remark during OCF one night when we were talking about why we come to church, and sort of everybody, 18, 19, 20-year-olds in the early 2000s answered, we come to receive the Eucharist, as I think we had been taught, certainly growing up in the 80s and 90s. And you said, I think if I asked a group of Baptist kids this, they would say they came to hear to hear the sermon, to hear the preaching to hear the preaching of the Gospels. And that was, to this day, when I sort of engage with especially Protestant Christianity, but certainly Western Christianity kind of generally, understanding that fundamental difference has been incredibly helpful to me.
Yeah. Oh yeah, for sure. Definitely.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, just
so
real big difference. A real big difference between Orthodoxy and most, if not all, the Protestant traditions is this understanding of Holy Communion, the Eucharist. Some Protestant Christians, it's offered once in a while, all these kinds of things, so yeah, it's a very, very different approach. Obviously in the Roman Catholic Church, Mass is the Eucharist. And so people receive, pretty regularly there. It's, again, the reason they go to church.
Yeah, no, I think it's really interesting. I just think that really has helped me frame sort of that. And just kind of dealing with how do you get people, especially when there's all this folk tradition in Orthodox, A, communion is super important, and B, there's this huge folk tradition around preparation that really does seem, I think, for a lot of millennials or whatever, untenable.
Yeah.
I think that's a real challenge.
And so, because I think in some ways it's probably easier just to observe the discipline on a consistent basis. Wednesdays, Fridays, the seasons, the particular holidays where we observe a fast of some kind, then to kind of, I think that's, in some ways, it just creates this rhythm for us today, especially with today's millennials, but even for a lot of us, I think, we're much more comfortable as vegetarians in our society, in our world today. We're seeing the effects of that for health, so, but again, it's not just about a diet, it's about a discipline that allows us, that is somehow connecting us deeper to our relationship to God. It's not a negation of food because food is bad. It's about creating space for our relationship to God, and to recognize, maybe it's hard to find God on a full stomach. That, after a double, triple cheeseburger kind of thing, kind of hard to find God in that moment. And so that this opens us up. And I think what's so interesting about it, again, going back to the earliest days of the church, I came across a document from the mid-2nd century, so like the 150s. The Shepherd of Hermas says, calculate how much you would spend on all of those things that you would normally eat and give that to the poor.
Well, that's
right?
interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so there's the sense of tying this discipline in our relationship to God, but our relationship to our neighbor. How can we ask, you think of the poverty-stricken people of our society who, oh, we're going to tell you to fast.
Yeah.
Right. Not eat certain things when you're lucky, when you probably want, and when you have to go to a shelter or a soup kitchen to get a meal. I'm fasting. I can't. Thank you, soup kitchen, but I can't eat this. There's a logic here, and I think for us, especially as Americans, we live in a society of tremendous abundance, right? I think the fasting discipline can make us very conscious of that. You mentioned lobster before, right? Yes, it observes the rules, but it's still pretty pricey in most places. We live in a place of tremendous abundance. And so to observe a fasting discipline, when we can open up our fridge and eat in our freezers and eat just about anything we want, I think really brings us to some consciousness about, is this the way we're supposed to really be living? And it's the old saying, eat simply so others may simply live.
Yeah. I think you actually have segued. I think this is so important. You've actually segued into kind of where I wanted to not quite end, but kind of arrive, as it were. In light of what you've just said, I think about sort of in many of the ways that it's easier to observe the fasting disciplines of the church today than it has been. It really is not so much that they've closed the butcher shops in Byzantium, but that they there's vegan restaurants, and there are it's very easy, certainly easier for me to fast, for example, than my grandparents, in terms of what's available to me.
Yeah, the options are enormous.
Yeah, I mean, just I could just kind of basically continue to eat as I do, with substitutions. And I guess this plays into this question of identity then. I think it's easier in our culture to fast, to follow the fasting rules as they're sort of laid out than ever before. But I think in the diaspora, our fasting practices play a role in identity maintenance of some kind, right? In sort of keeping boundaries about. So I was wondering, if you could kind of comment on what you see the role of fasting is in Greek and maybe diaspora identity, and how the sort of shifting, food practices in our culture have changed that or challenged that.
Yeah, I think what we become more and more aware of is the issue of what is the principle of fasting, and how is it's observing a fast that is part of who I am as a Greek Orthodox Christian, right? And understanding the principle of fasting around it, that what I'm not supposed to eat, right? We don't eat meat, we don't dairy products, eggs, oil, and things that come from those, butter, right? Right, no cheese, no chicken is meat, right? There's younger viewers, chicken is meat, so no chicken. All these kinds of things. And so we know this is the principle, and so I grew growing up, third, fourth generation individual that I am, I still fasted like a quote unquote Greek, fasolada, lentils, pasta, those kinds of things. And then all of it, but then all of a sudden, because we're now outside of the historic cultural support system of, you go to Greece now, and the society, by and large, you still see the message of fasting and abstinence from foods in the society, right? There is mixarakosti at the McDonald's in Lent, in Athens, right? Mixarakosti. Other places, I'll never forget this one. It was the Grigoris, the pita places, the spanakopita places. Saranda meres, saranda yevsis, right? That kind of thing. So it's there, it's baked in. Here in the United States, and we're outside of the places like that, we've understood the principle. It becomes part of who we are as Orthodox Christians, that we're observing a discipline that is definitely different than even our Roman Catholic friends observe today. So it is part of that, quoting, making us different from them, because we observe a stricter approach to this. And then, with all of that arming us, we realize, like I said, if McDonald's is doing it in Greece, that we're doing it, we can do this here, we do this here in the States. We meet our other Orthodox friends, our Arab friends, I don't pick on my Arab friends, Antiochian friends, and we discover hummus and tabbouleh and, right, all that kind of stuff that, oh wait, this observes the fast, right? This observes the fast. We discover the food options, the restaurant options around us. I mean, we live in a society with vegetarian restaurants, Chinese restaurants, Indian restaurants,
which observe the fast frequently.
Which is very easy to observe a fast in. When you go to a Chinese restaurant, you can get a pretty good vegetarian style meal that's probably perfectly observing all of the rules, right? So we've discovered all of that, and we've incorporated that into our practice as well. So it's, and as I like to say, and it's kind of at a, somewhat humorous, but I think as Greek Americans in particular, I think everyone can identify with it. Peanut butter. I mean, it's an American invention, right?
Yeah.
The peanut butter and jelly sandwich was an American invention.
Yeah.
And you look at that peanut butter and jelly sandwich and go, it fits. And I don't know too many Greek American kids that can probably get through a fast period, a fasting day, and Greek American parents with their kids that don't somehow incorporate the peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Right?
I mean, especially at school, and
Yeah, and now we live in a transnational kind of environment, international environment. And like I said, if you're traveling in Greece and you see McDonald's with mixarakosti, you know that they've adapted the traditional McDonald's menu to meet a Greek need. Otherwise, they may as well just shut the restaurants for 40 days.
Yeah.
You just can't do that. And I have in my head a memory of visiting Mount Athos many, many years ago and seeing peanut butter jars on the table of the refectory. Now, unless I was delusional because I'd been up all night in services, an American product winding up in the refectory tables of Mount Athos tells you an awful lot right? About how these ideas move back and forth today. And so I think that's how, and again, it points to the dynamic nature of our identity, that as we continue to live outside of these traditional places, and it is adapting to the situation that we find ourselves in. And again, I'll go back to the even the attitude of the document I referenced at the beginning. There is a strong sense of recognizing this kind of local need and conditions. I mean, the fast isn't meant to hurt us. If you're on medication, physically infirm, all of those kinds of things, with some guidance, your parish priest, spiritual father, whatever, which either one, to figure out what is going to work for you and how do you observe this. And even the tradition, as I've been reading, gives a lot of discretion in that relationship to what's appropriate for the individual. That I think is important to know. So so I think that also is a piece of this as well.
So I mean, if I can paraphrase what you're saying and see if I'm getting this right, because I think this is actually really important. I don't think I've ever heard it kind of articulated that way, but I think it's important. I think part of what you're saying is there is this received tradition about how to fast and how to sort of obtain that goal of getting closer to God. And we're offered from the tradition these rules, but that in individual there is room and elasticity for individual situations done in conversation with a spiritual father, with somebody. Not sort of you alone in your room deciding these things, but that if the goal is to get closer to God, that goal is more important maybe than not having a hamburger.
Yeah. I mean, and again, the first and foremost, this practice is meant to bring us closer to God, not meant to harm us. It's not about it's a means to a greater end. And so it's just part of who we are and part of this discipline that we observe. Yeah, absolutely. And again, I pastor a congregation that has a fair number of elderly people in it, and so I have to be really careful with what I tell them to do and not to do, because they've got their meds and things like that, and what they were told. I remember many years ago a dramatic encounter with someone who told me a story of being devastated. It was a woman. She could not participate in pre-sanctified liturgies because she had been told she needed to fast all day before this evening liturgy, and she suffered from extremely blood sugar problems. And so she would become, over the course of the day, she was so weak and so weakened by this, and then she would go to church, literally was passing out all the time. And what am I supposed to do? And I had a very simple answer: eat lunch. Right? This isn't meant to harm you. Eat something. And again, even the ancient tradition knew that. There's an entire practice of xerophagia, eating dry foods, a fig, a few nuts, right? Something like that, because they know you can't some people necessarily can get through the whole day before they receive Holy Communion.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so when I'm in this counter with this person to say, eat lunch, you're not going to run to McDonald's and get the quarter pounder with cheese, but eat something to get you to that spot. This was a great revelation to her, the person, that this was possible. And it was like lifting this huge burden off of her because she really wanted to partake in the pre-sanctified liturgies.
Yeah. I mean,
again, I said, yeah, go talk to somebody about what you can and can't eat. But the simple rule is eat lunch. We're recording this on a Wednesday. We're not pre-sanctified liturgies tonight in most of our parishes. It's 7 o'clock in the evening in a lot of places. So it's a very long period. And again, the tradition understood that. It's not.
And I think that's really important. I mean, I have really, not me so much because, my family did say, eat lunch if you need to eat lunch, sort of thing. But, I knew people who, it put a really bad taste in their mouth for the church in general, because they'd go to the pre-sanctified liturgies as a family during Lent, and they weren't allowed to eat all day while they were going to school and going to sports practices. And it was, even young and healthy, that was not feasible.
Right.
My final question is, what is your sort of, I guess, pitch, if you wanted to pitch it, for fasting, for people who maybe have, for people in general, what is your pitch for fasting? Because I think we tend to think of fasting in the context of giving up things, of abstaining from things. It is abstinence. But what would be sort of your pitch on why you should give fasting a go?
Oh, it was something I was taught by a parish priest many years ago. It's a very simple kind of phrase. We're saying no to food and certain kinds of food so that we can say yes to God. And I think it's this putting it in balance. It's not, so that's one. And then when it gets beyond that is understand the principles that are at work in the discipline of what we're the meat, the dairy, etc. The principles that are at stake, that in terms of the way we practice this. And then talk to somebody about how you're going to observe it, especially if you've not done it before. And so somebody who's a kind of a quote unquote master at it, or at least has been doing this longer, your parish priest, the spiritual father, even your parents might have a good sense of this. I mean, if it's a young person, how you might observe it. And then, start doing it. I mean, it can be a bit challenging, but again, understand all of that, how it works. And then you have to navigate through it though, how you're going to observe it. Again, if you're doing the sports practices and things like that, how do you eat and stay alert? Again, how do you eat, stay alert, go to church services, all those things. And again, the tradition gets it. Yeah. It's that people that are working out there all day long have to fast differently than someone else. It's okay. And we get that. So then there's that. And then the navigation of the restaurant choices, the navigation of the alternatives. I got asked the question about, is it okay to eat the meat substitutes that are out there, the plant-based meats that are out there? It's like, well, you sit there, what's the goal here? What do you got to do? And we've been dealing with substitutes since they invented non-dairy creamer. Right?
Almond milk, man.
Right. I'm an almond milk person. I don't, but we've been since the invention of Coffee Mate. Sorry to plug a brand here, or as the Greeks would call it, the sconi. To put in your coffee. We've been navigating through that. So the question becomes how, why, what's appropriate in the setting. I would think of parents with children, you're trying to observe the fast. Yeah, you might need to do the meat substitute stuff to put in the spaghetti sauce or to make a burger that appeals to a child. Again, I'll pick on our OCF experience. We did that all the time.
Yeah.
We did that all the time. And on a funny story, I don't know if it was when you were at the OCF, Will, who was cooking those meals, made a tofu-based dessert, like a cheesecakey kind of dessert. And he said, he remember asking all the young people at the event, at the OCF meeting, well, what'd you think? I'd never made it before, what'd you think? And one of the comments was, well, at least it was cold. And we never made it again. So, it's a point of, we do these things to make space, to make space for God, and to challenge our relationship, and to think about our relationship to what we need in our lives. And we need God more than we need, these amazingly extravagant lifestyles that probably most of us have, especially in the Americas, around food. And that if it makes us conscious of all of that, I think we're moving in the right direction.
Thank you so much. That's brilliant. So here is our little tradition Cairo and I started originally on the podcast because we like to amuse ourselves. So James Lipton hosted Inside the Actors Studio. And so he has these questions. They're rapid fire. We don't want you to think too hard.
Okay.
But we will ask these questions, and then that is how we end.
Okay.
Okay. Ready, Father?
I think so.
What is your favorite word?
But. Every sentence I have, there's everything I write, there's always like one idea, then there's a but.
That is the mark of a good scholar. What is your least favorite word?
Absolutely.
What excites you creatively, spiritually, or emotionally?
Oh, wow. Beautiful art.
What turns you off?
In the same way?
Yeah, creatively, spiritually.
Ugliness, really ugliness. Yeah, kind of the absolute opposite.
Who would you like to see on a new banknote?
An American banknote? Oh, wow. Martin Luther King.
Okay. What sound or noise do you love?
The sound of a piano.
What sound or noise do you hate?
Airplanes at 5 o'clock in the morning.
What profession other than your own would you like to attempt?
Architecture.
Who is your favorite fictional hero?
Oh, I don't read a lot of fiction. This is tough. It'll come out of it's going to come from film.
Okay.
This is cheesy. Luke Skywalker.
Excellent. Okay, last question. And the pressure's on considering your current profession. Ready?
Mm-hmm.
If heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you arrive at the pearly gates?
Welcome.
we had someone say, "Oh, you're here," and then he thought for a second. He thought, "I don't want God to be too surprised I'm at the pearly gates."
Yeah, I don't want to say, "There's the door."
Exactly.
What are you doing here?
Clearly, there's been a bureaucratic mix-up. Thank you so much. I really appreciate this. The document from the Council of Crete, once again, is below in the comment, not in the comment, in the dialogue box. Father, thank you so much for joining us. Have a wonderful Pascha, an early Kelaidis.
To you as
well. And hopefully come back and join us sometime.
Yeah, I would love to. As I said, when you invited me, it might give me a reason when next time I'm in Chicago to visit the museum, which I saw from the idea stage to see it constructed, but I've yet to step foot in the place. And it's certainly because of COVID, I haven't been to Chicago very often. So,
well, when we are allowed to travel freely again, you let me know when you'll be there, and we'll take you around the museum.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.